We are quite excited in the Friends of St Mary's because we have finally got approval for some of the tombstones in the churchyard to be repaired so that they're no longer a danger to visitors to the churchyard. And work is due to commence on the 2nd of May for the first 4 tombstones that we are going to have repaired. At not inconsiderable cost, but there we are. That's why we have events like this, to raise money to help to pay for them. So that's the breaking news, as it were, that we're getting on with this work after 3 years of toil and trouble. But we're at last going to see some of the rewards of our efforts, and we will be a lot safer in the churchyard, so I'm told. This afternoon is the 3rd and final talk this year, and it's a great pleasure to welcome Andrew Wright to the village and to thank him very much for volunteering to speak to us this afternoon about the Seafarers mission. It's not something that I know anything much about, so I look forward to being educated on the Seafarers mission. But before that, a little background on Andrew. He went to school in Oxford. He went to St Andrew's University to read theology. He then did the preparations for his ordination in Cambridge. And then he went to various parishes in the northwest of England, to Wigan, to Carlisle, and there's one other one. Liverpool. Then after a long time doing parish work, he then came back to Oxfordshire to work in a co-educational boarding school in Oxford, where he spent the next 16 years as the head of religious studies, the chaplain to the school, and of course a housemaster as well. And he did that for 16 years and then decided to change tack, and he became involved in seafarer type duties, first of all with a subsidiary of the Seafarers mission, but then he's been with the Seafarers mission since 2007, is that right?
2013.
2013. And at that point I think I will sit down and hand the floor over to Andrew.
Thank you. Well, friends and neighbours, it's great to be living in Bampton now. We really are enjoying living in Bampton. It's wonderful to be here. Got to know quite a few of you already. As it happens, I'm not the only person from Mission to Seafarers who's in the audience, because Ron Curtis, who some of you know, is obviously been working with Mission to Seafarers, Mediterranean Mission to Seafarers in Gibraltar. So I should have put some Gibraltar slides up rather than. Ron's never here. I mean, he's always in Portugal or something, so it's very nice to see you, Ron. And talking about my CV, there's a few people in the room who've had to do with my CV, not least Ron Lloyd, who of course was my religious studies teacher and chaplain when I was 11. And a brilliant teacher he was as well, and a lovely guy. So great to be here. And talking about wokeism, of course, the Mission to Seafarers, which is pretty fairly well known around the UK, I think, particularly from those days when we had so many British seafarers, was of course until 2000 we were missions to seamen, but it changed in 2000 because there are actually quite a few women seafarers. I'll say something about that later, but so we are now mission to seafarers. Anyway, very nice of you to turn out on a Sunday afternoon to learn about seafarers and a little bit about our work. So great to be here. So I thought I'd start at this point. About 4 weeks ago, I was in Panama. Have any of you been through the Panama Canal? No one. It's a really interesting place. You see, this is going through one of the locks, and if you can see, they have these little trains, 3 each side of the ship, and they guide the ship through the locks. It's really interesting to watch. But we were standing at the Miraflores lock, and there were a lot of people there watching. And the seafarer up here, suddenly he waved, and the whole crowd waved back. And I actually found it a really moving moment because seafarers, as I'll say in a minute, are so remote from our lives now that, and this guy probably was on a voyage, probably 2 weeks at least to get to the canal, then through the canal, probably not stopping in Panama, and probably another 2 weeks before they arrived at port. That's 4 weeks without seeing another human being at best. And suddenly there was this momentary contact of mutual waving, which I found really, really, really moving actually. But obviously seafarers are, as it says here, the invisible, underrated heroes of modern times. And that to a great extent is true, that we are all incredibly dependent on seafarers. A lot of what we're wearing, a lot of what our houses are built of, a lot of the food we buy, the cars we drive, so much of our computers, certainly probably our phones, which we just heard going off, they pretty much all come to us by ship. And if we didn't have seafarers, our lives would be massively impoverished and indeed put at risk. And yet people don't think about seafarers anymore. They're very remote from our lives for reasons which we'll go into in a minute. And perhaps a few things recently have, just put here, the problem of sea blindness. In maritime we call it sea blindness. Here's a few. This on the right there, that's the port of Los Angeles, and modern ports tend to be very, very mechanised, very impersonal, places which are very remote from communities often, and often difficult for seafarers to access local communities. Sometimes, the slide second from left, this one here, this is a pier I drove down last November in Australia. This is one of the iron ore ports called Port Walcott. That is a mile long. And the ships come at the end, they load up their iron ore and then they go off. And the seafarers in this port cannot get off the ships. This one here is another place I've visited recently. We're trying to start work here. This is actually the port of Lima in Peru. Lima is such a dangerous place, particularly where the port is, that seafarers, again, they cannot come off the ships. They can't leave the port because the risks of their personal safety would be far too high. And of course, a lot of the time, they're out at sea. And ships now, unlike 30 years ago, ships turn around very quickly. They're often only in port 8, 10, 12 hours. Very quick, and while they're in port, very, very busy for the crew. And in the old days, they would come into port for 3 weeks, and they would have a lot of time in port. And in those days, the crews would come off and they'd play football matches against other ships and all that kind of thing. That's all gone now. So they have become much more remote. And it is a real problem in terms of capturing people's awareness of what it means to be of seafaring. But we all know, so I just said this, 90% of everything, or 90% plus of everything that we consume and use comes by sea. And that's a really good book to read, Rose George's book, 90% of Everything, to give you a picture of what seafaring is like. This ship here, this is the sister ship of the Ever Given. These are the world's largest container ships. You won't be able to read it here, but this ship if you lay the number of containers it has on board, 22,992 containers, and if you lay them all end to end, they would stretch for 91 miles. It's incredible. And they can carry 530 million mobile phones, 9.6 million flat screen TVs, or 2.4 million washing machines. It's incredible. And actually, an interesting figure I had last week there, so there are 11 billion tonnes of cargo are moved by ship every year. That's 1.5 tonnes for every man, woman and child on the planet. That's quite amazing. So we are incredibly dependent on these guys, and yet they are very much forgotten. And they are forgotten heroes because actually the sacrifices they make are quite extraordinary. So 3 things have happened recently which have probably upped their visibility a little bit. One has been during the result of the pandemic, And you may remember this because it did get into the news quite a bit and made numbers of new people think about seafarers, and that was the crew change crisis. Because of the pandemic, they weren't able to get off their ships because ports weren't allowing them in because they had such tight immigration procedures, and even if you got in, hardly any airlines were flying, so you couldn't go anywhere. So these guys who would normally do between 9 and 12 months on their contracts, that is a long time in itself, they had to go on working. So many of them did a minimum of 17 months. I met some who'd done 24 months non-stop working. Imagine the pressures of that, and that's hard work as well. Living on the ship, unable to get off because they weren't able to leave their ships at all, and in some ports they're still not allowed to leave their ships. And in many cases, no access to communication facilities, so not able to talk to their families. So this began to get into the news a bit. I mean, they were essential workers of the highest order, making the most extraordinary sacrifices, and it was an incredibly stressful time for them. I mean, one of my chaplains talked about a mental health pandemic paralleling the pandemic, and it really was like that. So that began, in some people's minds anyway, to get that did filter through to the general public and remind them, certainly in the shipping industry, where even in shipping sometimes seafarers get forgotten, they began to really, they really started thinking about seafarer well-being. Another thing that happened was the Ever Given. Remember this? Trapped in the Suez Canal. 6 days. We were actually asked to visit that ship a few times in Egypt because when they did eventually free the ship, they were arrested, and the crew were absolutely terrified that they were going to be sent to prison for years. And there was a long wait while there was a big argument over the Suez Canal. I think the Suez Canal claimed $960 million in compensation. So obviously there was a lot of argument about that. And actually the P&I company who were responsible for paying insurance are one of our funders, so that was quite interesting for us. But anyway, that again, and of course all that shipping got stuck, and a lot of deliveries were really heavily delayed, and that again began to get seafaring into people's minds, because began to make people realise they were really dependent on seafarers. And this is some of the things that there were 400 ships at either end of the canal by the end of 6 days, waiting, trapped. If you go round the Cape rather than through the Suez Canal, it's $450,000 additional cost, $916 million in compensation. So it was just a reminder how we are incredibly dependent on shipping, and if the system breaks down, then you're in real trouble. This is another thing which happened about 2 years ago. We deal with a lot of abandoned ships. Abandoned ships is a real curse. These are ships where their owners go bankrupt and they walk away from the ships, but they leave the crew on board, and sometimes the ship is at anchor, out at sea, or sometimes it's in port. This ship, which we had been working with off the coast of Dubai, it was several miles off the coast of Dubai under anchor. And it had been abandoned for 32 months. These guys had been 32 months on the ship without going anywhere, with no food, no water. We were taking food, water, fuel out to the ship by boat. And there were 5 seafarers left, and they can't leave the ship because they don't have papers, they don't actually have access to the shore, and also authorities won't let them because there's a minimum level you've got to have on a ship. So they're completely trapped. They also don't want to leave because they want to get their money, and if they leave the ship, they won't get their money back. So what happened to this ship though, it's a very invisible problem. But one night there was a storm and the ship dragged its anchors and it ended up on this beach. This is a tourist beach in Dubai. So suddenly a really invisible problem became incredibly visible. And it still took a long time, and we do a lot of work, advocacy work, especially in countries like this because there are no unions allowed. So we did all the advocacy work with the government And eventually, after about 4 months on the beach, we managed to get the men off, and we got 70% of their back pay, which is quite a good result. And this guy, Nai Win, he was the engineer. That's him being taken to the airport in Dubai and going home and seeing his family for the first time for 4 years. But that was a very invisible problem that suddenly became visible. So there's been a few things recently that have perhaps made people think about seafarers a bit more. There are 63,000 merchant ships, excluding fishing. There are 1.6 million commercial seafarers. There are 39 million fishers globally and 4.6 million fishing vessels. So there's a lot of ships around the world, and there's a lot of seafarers and fishermen. Of course, once 50 years ago, or certainly up until the Second World War, British seafarers have been very big. I think in 1939 there were 200,000 British seafarers. It's a really small number now. But mainly crew nationalities. 25% of seafarers are Filipinos, and also Chinese, Indian, Indonesia. Russian and Ukrainian make up 15% of seafarers, and that caused a huge problem at the start of the war. 1.8% are British. A lot of those actually work in sectors like the super yacht sector. And there are 25,000 women, most of whom are working on cruise ships. But I do occasionally meet women on board. I saw one, I met one the other day actually in Cyprus. So you do see women. A few of my own seafaring experiences. So when I first went to the Fisherman's Mission in 2007, my first week I was sent out in a trawler from Shetland. And that was an amazing experience. I learned a lot of things very quickly. One was that fishing has a very, very bad safety culture. I mean, I arrived and no one gave me anything. This is where an emergency, here's the life jacket. It's nothing like that. I never saw a life jacket in my whole time on board. And it really is incredibly dangerous. All that machinery, you're only this, the deck, the gunnels are only this steep. So it was all weathers. And I took, as you can see, I took part gutting fish, etc., etc. But it was a very difficult trip because I don't think they realised I was a priest. And fishermen think having a priest on board is very bad luck. And things kept going wrong. So the hauls were quite poor. And also we had some equipment failures which cost them a lot of money, so we lost some netting and so on. And the longer it went on, I began to think a lot about Jonah. I thought, if these guys chuck me over the side, they think I'm bad luck. No, that's what we last saw him walking on the deck. Anyway, it was a real. But what I really learned from that trip is the hiddenness of seafaring. You really, really feel alone and remote, and what goes on at sea can so easily be hidden, and that makes abuses really possible in shipping. So that was a very interesting week, and I'll say a bit more about fishing in a minute. I will now actually. Sorry, go back. So here's a few other fishing stories. Fishing is where we see most abuses, human rights abuses in fishing. There are very, very few protections for fishermen around the world, and that includes in the UK. When I was at the Fisherman's Mission, we began to get a lot of foreign fishermen, a lot of foreign fishermen working in the UK, and they came over on visas which are designed for people changing ships. So you can get a visa because you're joining a ship and then the ship's going off somewhere else. And in fact, they came on these visas, but they were fishing from UK ports, and they usually had 12-month contracts, say. And there was a lot of them were being brought over by illegal crewing companies in the Philippines or India, for example. And these guys would go to the agency, and they'd be shown these incredible ships. You're going to go over to here's your ship. It looks really nice. You'd sign these contracts, and then they'd come over to the UK, and they'd be met at the airport by someone, and their contract would be ripped up, and they'd be given another contract to sign. And I saw one of these contracts, and it just said it had 3 clauses: name. And then the second clause was, I promise to do everything the captain tells me. And the third one was, if my work, I understand that I will not be paid for the first three months, and if the captain's not happy with my work, that money can be used to repatriate me. That was the contract. And a lot of them were going on boats which had no proper living accommodation, sometimes boats with not even running water, and they were living on there for 3 months. And it became a massive problem. And we found it incredibly difficult to get anyone to believe, or to get an agency to take responsibility, because some felt they were responsible for the boat, but the structure of the boat, they couldn't take responsibility for the crew. Eventually, we got one Scottish police force to take an interest, and actually a series of raids were carried out on vessels. So we did begin to make some progress, but there was a lot of problems even in the UK. This picture here is actually in the Falkland Islands, where we also were doing a lot of work, and this is a terrible situation where there's a lot of vessels that are after squid, and they're largely from Korea and Taiwan, but they use labour which they get from anywhere. Actually, these are Vietnamese. They use a lot of Vietnamese. And these ships, these people who often go to sea, again, sometimes it's traffic labour and so on, but these guys are often at sea 3 years without ever getting off the ship, and often not even going into a port. Often the fish is transshipped at sea, or they oil at sea, and the abuse levels there are horrific. And I partly went to the Falklands because we heard that there were a lot of these guys jumping over the side when they're off the Falklands into the South Atlantic. Many of them would die. And in the week I was there, we had 3 jumpers. These were 2 of them. As these ones were rescued, the third one was also rescued, but was very badly injured. You can imagine how desperate you've got to be to jump off the vessels. So we were doing a lot of work with the Falkland Islands government to try and get them to inspect these ships, inspect the accommodation, demand certain standards, and I think things are now much better. This is meeting fishermen in Cape Town, South Africa. Again, there are a lot of problems, vessels there. As a guy here, one of these guys among these vessels have been 7 years without going home. And these are just terrible, terrible ships. I mean, the conditions are unthinkably bad. No safety issues at all. A lot of these guys bare feet, so the fishing is a really, really grim story. This is actually contrasting. This is the Lunar Bow. This is Britain's largest fishing boat. It's a pelagic fishing boat, which catches mackerel and so on mid-water. And these guys do so well that often they can only fish for 6 weeks because they run out of quota then. But in 6 weeks they can make millions of pounds, millions. And we actually, this boat, we got it to come up for Seafarers Awareness Week, and it was quite fun. I joined this ship off Ramsgate in the pilot boat and came up the Thames, and they opened the bridge for us, which was fun. And then we moored up alongside the Belfast. So fishing is a big issue. When I first went to the mission to Seafarers, I spent some time on a container ship. This is the Manila Express. We went through various ports around Europe. Really, really interesting experience. Mixed crew. These were mainly Indians, Ukrainians, Chinese, Sri Lankans, mixed crews. So fairly typical of what you might see. Lovely, lovely crew, and a very good captain as well. Looked after his people well. Good, nice sense of community. But again, you got a real sense of the challenges of being away from home for so long, and of living very remotely, and indeed of the enormous stresses on their time, particularly when they're in an area where you're going through ports quite quickly. And now another personal experience is, you might see Charlotte sometimes. She comes to Bampton quite often. That's our youngest daughter, and she worked in a totally different sector, the super yacht sector. She was the chief stewardess for 13 years. And that's a sector which I've become quite interested in, partly because of her, partly because we're getting a lot of reports about issues in that sector, particularly around women, harassment, alcohol's a big problem, drugs are a problem, And we certainly lived 13 years. She's had some wonderful experiences, but she's been on some very, very difficult places as well, with some really bad skippers and very difficult owners. I mean, there are some extraordinary owners in super yachts. I had a complaint from one the other day where the guy had been sacked because the Russian wife of the owner didn't like men with tattoos. So he was just summarily sacked on the spot. But we had another one actually recently, which was quite interesting. They had a mid-Atlantic party on a crossing of the Atlantic, and they all went for a swim, and they put a rope out the back, and this girl had got left behind on the swim. They did eventually come back for her, but she was utterly traumatised by that, and we had to arrange counselling for her. Anyway, some of these challenges that seafarers face, I mentioned some of them: remoteness from family, friends, and from normal support networks. Very long contracts, 9 to 12 months is normal, sometimes much longer. Communication with your families, it's getting better now because the internet is coming more onto ships, but it's still a long way off, and it's often very expensive. Physical danger, I mean, there are a lot of accidents still on ships. Isolation, and sometimes in multinational crews, where you get lots of nationalities, it can be really difficult because they're all meant to speak English, but often their English is poor quality. So if you're perhaps a single nationality with other nationalities, you can feel really, really isolated. Crews have got smaller as well, so there's less chance of building friendship and community. At the moment, one really big problem is shore leave. Many ports are still not allowing people to take shore leave, so you're stuck on the ship with the same people all the time. And vulnerability to international crisis. Well, we've talked about the crew change crisis, everything that happened during the pandemic. The Ukraine-Russia war has been a big deal. Imagine, particularly for Ukrainian seafarers, terribly worried about their families back home. Many of them were made refugees, some of them were killed. For a long time, they felt unable to go back because Ukraine wasn't allowing people to leave the country to go on ships. That's changed now. So for a long time, they felt they couldn't go back to their countries. And there's, of course, no access to spiritual support. Obviously, they don't have any church communities, for example, or other faith communities. And there is this huge problem of being very hidden. Just to remind you that seafaring and big accidents still happen. This is a very recent. This is the surviving crew of a vessel in the Black Sea which caught fire. Sadly, the captain of this ship died, and one other crew member did as well, and some others were severely injured. And this is a couple of our staff who flew up to be with them in a port in Turkey. That was just a reminder that seafaring is still dangerous in all sorts of ways. And imagine you've got these very enclosed spaces. You've got often very unsafe, dangerous cargoes, and they are very unsafe places still, despite all health and safety. So that's a little bit about seafarers. A little bit about us, Missions to Seafarers. Missions to Seamen was founded in 1856, so we're 166 years old this year. And when we started in the Bristol Channel, and we started with visiting ships at anchor. Of course, they were waiting for wind or waiting for tides. So that's how the work started, using launches and small boats to go out to meet seafarers. We were already campaigning early on. We were doing advocacy for seafarer abuses. This is a bit of a faded slide, but this gives you some idea. We work in 200 ports around the world, 50 countries, and although not all the ports are on there, because that would be impossible, that gives you a strong idea of where we are. We're broken down into 9 regions now. That's something we've done in recent years with regional leadership, but the head office is in London, and we broadly run things from there. You see, we cover the globe pretty comprehensively, and we would once have gone, it grew along empire lines, along empire shipping routes, and then expanded from there. So what do we do? Well, I'll say a bit more in detail, but basically we visit seafarers on board their ships. We provide centres where they can come and receive hospitality, and there's a whole series of facilities depending on the centre. I'll say more about that in a minute. This is actually our centre in Colombo, Sri Lanka. We do a lot of transport. We run buses to take them from the ships to the centres, or from the ships to local communities, or from ships to wherever they want to go to, often places of worship. And we, of course, do a lot of hospital visitation and the prison visitation as well, if that's happened. So, so here's some of our ship visitors. This is an interesting one. This is actually our ship. We obviously put a lot of store by wearing the right kit going on board ships and being safe, but this is some of our ship visitors in Sri Lanka who insist on I mean, imagine risking the ship in a white robe. That's what they do. This is in Dubai, this is in Panama, this is actually in Tilbury. And actually this is one of our interns, and we have quite a lot of young interns who come and work for us to give them experience. So a lot of what we do is going on board ship and meeting seafarers in their spaces. And we also run over 120 seafarer centres. Some of them are large. This is quite an interesting picture. Well, I'll show this one last. But these are actually seafarers. This is in France, where they were having a Burns night in the centre. It was really good. The seafarers loved it. Locals came and the seafarers were there and they were all dancing. It's fantastic. They'd actually brought a group. They brought a group out from Scotland to play. This is in Cyprus. This is a little tiny centre, and we've got a lot more of these centres now, which are suitable for modern times. This is Thunder Bay in northern Canada on Lake Superior, where you get a lot of big ships coming down there, actually. This is in southern India. This one is Durban, South Africa. This one's interesting because this is our newest centre. It's in Hong Kong. We did have, historically, if you've been to Hong Kong, we had a centre on the Kowloon side, overlooking Hong Kong Harbour. And it's been demolished now, and the local mission seafarers have done a deal with a hotel chain. So the new centre is 46 stories, of which the first 7 stories are a seafarers hotel, and the rest is a luxury hotel. So it's basically the deal's funded all their work. But this is nearly finished now. It's due to open next year, and then 4 weeks ago, this burned down. Well, it hasn't burnt down, but you might see it's gone on the news. This actually, the damage is less bad than it looks. The scaffolding all burnt down, and there has been damage, but the basic structure is still in place. So apparently, the delay is going to be about 12 months. But so that's probably our comeuppance for trying to build too big or something. So some of the things we did, obviously, the COVID has been a huge period for us. And Ron will have been closely involved in this at Gibraltar. But we weren't allowed to visit inside the ships, so we were visiting at the gangways, so we were maintaining contact with seafarers, which was critical because they couldn't get off the ships. And we did enormous amounts of shopping. We still are actually, because you imagine seafarers often come off the ship and they go and they buy toothpaste and they get their medicines if they need them, and they buy phone cards and just chocolates and crisps and all the things that make their lives a little bit different. So we've been doing huge amounts of shopping for them. In fact, the recorded levels of shopping last year, we did $3 million worth of shopping, 19,700 shopping visits by our teams. I think the real figure is actually much higher than that. And that's been transformational for seafarers. And it's included a lot of medicines because, particularly in the crude change crisis, if for example, they had regular medication, they had enough to go through to their 9-month contract. But when the contract became 12 or 17 months, ran out of key medicines. And it was very, very difficult accessing them. So we were accessing them from local doctors, pharmacists, taking to the seafarers. We were also providing MiFi units. That's the unit, enabling them to log in and talk to their families. That's critical, and that's a thank you note from one ship for that. We also did a lot of work in some areas, this is India. We also did a lot of work in the Philippines
emergency food for families who were really struggling in the pandemic. And remember that big Indian crisis when it all blew up in India? They became very difficult, and we gave out huge amounts of emergency packages there. So a lot of that sort of work. Another thing we became very heavily involved in was vaccinations. Seafarers desperately needed vaccination because without vaccination certificates they couldn't get through the ports, either to join their ships or to get home. And yet no countries were wanting to give their precious vaccines to visiting seafarers. So we did an enormous amount of lobbying work. This is actually in Australia on the left-hand side, where they set up work with health services. They set up a little clinic just by the side of the ship and were vaccinating there. This is Ruth. She's our incredible chaplain in Tilbury. She led a project working with a small NHS team there. And last week they vaccinated their 42,000th seafarer. It's an amazing piece of work. I'm actually going to see Ruth tomorrow. So she's done absolutely incredible work. The other thing, we've been obviously doing a lot more digital services now. So we ran something in the pandemic. We set up something called Chat to a Chaplain, which meant that seafarers who couldn't meet us physically were able to interact with us digitally. And that was really, really heavily used. People seeking advice or friendship or a prayer even. So that was, and we're doing a lot more work now digitally, and that will be a big thing for the future. I've mentioned advocacy, where I talked about the abandoned shipping. A lot of work we do in some areas of the world, the Gulf, India, Africa. These are places where you get quite a few abandoned ships. This was a really big case we dealt with. Again, this some of you may remember this, the Seaman Guard Ohio. It was an anti-piracy ship, which we still do have piracy issues, and they were basically running protection. And there was 20 crew there, including 6 British guards. And there was a storm, and they went into an Indian port for shelter. And they had guns because they were anti-piracy. And the authorities said that the guns were illegal, they didn't have the right licenses, and they were all imprisoned. They did nearly 5 years in prison. And we did, again, we were visiting in prison, we did a lot of advocacy work for them, and in the end, after 4.5 years, the case was overturned and they were found not guilty and repatriated, but 4.5 years in prison in Chennai. This is this is our chaplain in Dubai, who's done a huge amount of advocacy work. This is our chaplain in Cyprus, and this is actually one crew I visited in northern Cyprus, where this is the day they just heard that the vessel had been sold and they were going to be paid and get home. So one or two other things here. We've got a whole series of wider projects that we do. We run a whole series of educational programs, which are at the moment focused on the internet, which are on helping seafarers to use, and their families to use the internet safely and well, because if they have got Wi-Fi at sea, which they increasingly do, hearing problems from home can be massively destabilising because you're helpless to do anything. So how do you communicate effectively with your family? How does the family communicate with you in a safe and good way? And we're also doing a lot of work on financial advice. We run a whole series of family projects. These are some of them. This is in the Philippines. We have a huge family support network there, working with seafarers' families all over the Philippines. This one's in Myanmar, and there's another one in India. This is our trial work with super yachts. We sent a team to Parma to work with super yacht crew just before the pandemic, and we're hoping to take that forward. And now we also run this thing called the Seafarers Happiness Index, which is a way of measuring seafarer well-being. How are seafarers feeling? We do it 4 times a year. We ask the same questions so we can tell how it's changing over time. And the industry is now using that as a benchmark for how seafarers are feeling. And they also are using it, and some shipping companies have asked for bespoke versions of it so they can look at exactly how their seafarers are feeling, which has been really, really good. I'm very, very proud of that project. We also did some work on one of the migrant rescue vessels in the Mediterranean. We sent a chaplain on board there at the height of the migrant crisis in the Mediterranean. A lot of work. The Sea newspaper is one of the biggest global seafarers multilingual paper which we produce several times a year. and goes out to all seafarers, both digitally and in physical form. So that's all the stuff we do. A few last slides to do. Somebody said, are you going to show some of your global shots? So this is just, of course, a lot of my life is spent behind desks in offices or in hotels in industrial estates. But I just dug a few of my. I've just finished 10 years, so I was reviewing some of my pictures. Just to give you a sort of day in the life of the Secretary General. This is in Port Headland, just last year actually. This is Port Headland was in the news this week because it was that place in Australia that just dodged the cyclone, the number 5, level 5 cyclone. This is the world's biggest iron ore port, incredible port, very, very remote, very difficult place for seafarers. We have a really, really good team there doing really good work. They have to take the seafarers off the ships by launch. It's the only way they can get to shore. There's very few facilities in town, so they run a big supermarket and a very, very nice centre where seafarers can get some downtime from the ships. So I was just being given a tour of Port Headland Harbour here, an incredible place. This is Argentina. We're doing a lot more work now in Latin America. And this is some senior people from the Argentinian Navy. We were negotiating with them to get port access. That was a really, really productive meeting as well. This is a view. This is in Taiwan. This is a photograph the Chinese won't like because this is the Vice President of Taiwan coming to one of our conferences in Taiwan. This is signing our agreement to work in Panama. This is the Panamanian Minister of Transport. We had a long process to agree because they've never had welfare work in Panama before. So this is our agreement. Also, Panama is the world's largest shipping flag, has more ships than anyone else. So it's a very, very important relationship we have with the Panamanian government. This is one that I thought was particularly appropriate moment. This is lecturing to the Ukrainian Maritime College in Odessa, giving a lecture to, these are all Ukrainian seafarers in training, and I wonder where they all are now, and I wonder where all their families are. This is in Japan. We did a whole series of events with Princess Anne and Satin in Japan, both with our teams in Japan, we've got a lot of work in Japan, but also with shipping industry in Japan, with whom we're building a big relationship now, because our relationships with shipping companies are really important because they're our main funders. And Princess Anne is brilliant for us. She does so much stuff for us all over the world, and it's an absolute pleasure to work with her. She is an amazing person, very robust, and does great work for us. This is being welcomed, in the typical being welcomed to the Philippines with one of my colleagues. This is on board one of the migrant ships in the Mediterranean, hearing about their work, and as I say, we did end up putting someone on board this ship to support. This is in Stornoway. I got taken out by the Coast Guard taken out on the helicopter. We were doing a lot of work with them in the Fisherman's Mission because a lot of crew medical evacuations are taken into Stornoway, where the Western Isles Hospital there. And they built a very strong relationship, with the result of which they took me up flying, which is good fun. And this is going down the Amazon. This is one of our remotest ports up the Amazon, a place called Barcarena. This is travelling up the Amazon on a ferry to get to this very remote port. This is quite a funny one. This is lecturing at the annual Super Yacht Investor Conference. And it was funny because my talk was on looking after your crew. The talk before me was on which helicopter should I buy, and the talk after me was on the latest in super yacht toys, which was mainly about submarines. But it was actually great fun. And this is visiting ships in Port Stanley in the Falkland Islands. I tried to give you a flavour from around the world. This is actually an interesting one. This is in Walvis Bay in Namibia, which is a very interesting place. And this is an Irish fishing boat which had been in the dockyard, and they asked me to bless their ship. So I went in, and this is our ship visitor in Walvis Bay, and so we blessed this ship, and then afterwards I blessed them holy water and sprinkled it around the cabin. And afterwards I saw the guy taking the water out, the rest of it, and pouring it all over his nets. Having said that, once at the fisherman's mission, we had one of those brand new pelagic trawlers I showed at Sweden. They asked the local guy in Peterhead to if he would bless their boat. And they couldn't arrange it before their first trip, and they went out on their first trip without having the ship blessed. And they had the most successful haul ever. I think they filled the ship up in one haul. I think it was 1.2 million pounds worth or something. And then they came back and the boat was blessed, and then they set off again and it broke down. I'm not sure how useful shipping vessel is. Anyway, does everyone know what this is? This is actually in Halifax, Nova Scotia. These are a lot of the Titanic wrecks. And interestingly, a lot of the Titanic bodies were evacuated to Halifax, partly because they didn't want to take them to New York because it was too public, but also because Halifax had a lot of cable-laying vessels which had very low sides, so they were perfect for going out there and repatriating the bodies, and huge numbers of them are buried in very nice graveyards there. So that was really interesting. Interestingly, 2 years later, after, I think in 1915 maybe, during the war, Halifax had the world's largest ever man-made non-nuclear explosion. And that was when there was an ammunition ship which caught fire. And it was a very dramatic fire, so all the people from town came and they gathered on the side, to watch it, and it blew up, killing huge numbers of people and destroying about half the town. I'd never heard about that before. That apparently was the world's largest ever non-nuclear man-made explosion. This is with our team in Myanmar. That, believe it or not, is Myanmar Anglican Cathedral. You wouldn't expect something like that there. That's our team there. And this is an unusual one. This is in Lesotho, which is not really a maritime place, as you know. It's very landlocked. But we were on the way back, and we had all our African teams came together just north of Lesotho. And this is driving back. This is the main road in Lesotho. And we got completely stuck in the mud, and all the locals came out to rescue us, which was nice, which was fun. And then this is a silly one. This is a dinner in Mangalore where I was made to look very, very stupid. This is never go to Indian dinners. But I sometimes tell this story about the bishop. One of the bishops from India, the senior bishop, was there at the conference. We were at a conference, and he didn't come to the dinner, though he was invited, and none of the clergy came to the dinner either. So we thought this is a bit odd. So afterwards, we made an inquiry. Where's the bishop? There are all these empty seats, and apparently he has a principle that he never goes to a function unless he's the guest of honour. Which I thought is a fantastic gospel principle. Until recently, we had our own quite large launch. The Fujairah anchorage off the Emirates is the largest ship's anchorage in the world. We actually had a ship which used to go and support all the ships of the anchorage called the Flying Angel. We've just got rid of it now because it became too old to operate. But this was the crew. This is with the crew of the Flying Angel. I think this is my last one. This is opening one of our new centres in Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. And this is interesting. I've become, a lot of the places I go in the world, apart from seafarers who are migrant workers, I meet a lot of migrant workers. And I preached at this church in Singapore, and it was absolutely packed. It was Indonesian Bahasa service. I preached in English. They didn't understand a word of it. It was translated. I'm always suspicious when they translate your sermons because you never know what they're saying. But anyway, these are all Indonesian domestic maids working in Singapore, and there were hundreds of them there. And it's a reminder, they all live, they do 12 months. They're allowed 1 day off a month. And they live, and often they're living in quite small houses. They live on rolled up mats on the floors of the kitchens, usually. And they obviously have left their children behind, often with their mothers, and they don't see their children for 12 months. And they're often badly treated. But the staggering thing, Seafarers are part of this group, but the levels of sacrifice of so many million workers around the world, it is unbelievable. I mean, just leaving your family behind and giving everything, doing it for your family, it's a hugely sacrificial thing. Filipino seafarers, the average Filipino seafarer is supporting between 18 and 20 people in their families, which is why they don't spend any money on themselves, they send it all back home. It's an incredible thing, and it's really, I find it really humbling actually. This is just to show that what a pastoral visit looks like. This is me coming off after a pastoral visit in the Hong Kong anchorage, and I can tell you that going on a lot of ships, there's virtually no health or safety, and it is unbelievably hairy. I was terrified.
Are you roped on?
Sorry?
Are you roped on?
No, nothing like that. You just have to get on with it. And the chances of making a false move are, and actually we go out, we had a launch in the Hong Kong anchorage. You can see the launch on the right there. But I visited a whole load of these ships by pilot ladder, and it's quite something. And you have to get your timing right as well. So that's pastoral visitation of a different kind. And that's such a good thing. Well, last thing is, of all the things I do around the world, I just love meeting seafarers. They are an incredible bunch of people. I've seen them in all sorts of circumstances, in all sorts of places, and indeed I have wonderful teams, including Ron, who isn't actually, Mediterranean Mission Seafarers are a sort of different, they're
affiliated to,
they're affiliated,
yes.
Independent, and actually we're hoping to work with them into the future to do some more work, because we want to spread our work into Algeciras. But Ron's done loads of this work, and actually on the ground, and I've been with Ron when he's done it, brilliant stuff. But they are a joy to work with, but they are often out of sight, out of mind, and so do spare them an occasional thought, because you are all utterly dependent on them. Thanks very much.
Andrew, thank you very much indeed. I don't know if anybody has any questions they want to ask.
You can ask them over cake.
We can ask over cake. That sounds like a very good idea. Jeremy,
So how are you financed?
We are a whole mixture of things. Increasingly, the shipping industry is brilliant for us and has become brilliant. So really, I'm always saying to shipping, we're obviously a Christian mission, and they actually quite like that, the fact that we've got that faith-based foundation. But of course our work is very holistic and practical. And I often say to them, we are a service deliverer for the shipping industry. And we're in the seafarers' happiness business. And happy seafarers, as one captain said to me, happy seafarers are good seafarers, happy seafarers are safe seafarers. You make seafarers happy. Thank you. It's a very nice summary of our work. So we do look to them to fund us, so we're getting substantial income from them. We're doing an event. We do events, so in Japan in 3 weeks we've got a huge event, a challenge event, 2 days, which should raise $750,000, that's the plan. Legacies are important, individual giving, church giving, so it's a whole mixture of sources. We have to raise, at the London end, we have to raise about $6 million a year. And then locally, a lot of stations are raising their own funds to support their work. So yeah, it's a mixture of stuff, but it's that kind of thing.
And do you succeed in doing that?
Yeah, the last two that we've thankfully got quite strong historic resources. So we are, most years we're running deficits, but it's planned deficits, so we can handle that. During COVID, actually, it was amazing. The first year of COVID, we were really, really worried because, the markets were tanking and, money fundraising was difficult. But the shipping industry really came on, and we actually increased our funding by 93% in the first year of COVID. And then the following year, it went up even more, and we had some very big legacies. So, yeah, so it's a mixture of that sort of thing. So we're doing all right, but it's a constant struggle, and it's been stressful at times.
Sounds like the Friends of St Mary's.
We're clearly a British-based organisation. Are there many other organisations around the world you can furthest one in the Mediterranean?
Um,
Many others that are doing sort of work?
We are. There's two. There's us, which we are probably the biggest in terms of the breadth of professional service we offer. Stella Maris, the Catholics, do a lot of work, but a lot of it's at quite a small level, sort of just a local priest who's asked to keep an eye on seafarers as well. There are other organisations, but most interestingly, most maritime welfare globally is based in the UK, and I think that goes back to Victorian philanthropism and also the fact that for so long London was the world centre of shipping. It still is important for shipping, but it's beginning to drift now eastwards. So Singapore is beginning to become more the centre. So we're doing a lot of work in Singapore to maintain relationships there and to build up fundraising there as well. So that's a big goal for us going forward. But yeah, we are a significant player in the maritime welfare scene, but we do have colleagues who try to work with them closely.
Yes, what was it that sort of pointed you towards the sequence mission as it was then? The first place, was there a specific incident you said you wanted to get involved, or?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because I didn't have a seafaring background, and although I'd always liked the sea. And so when I was at St Edwards, I thought I'd been teaching at St Edwards for 16 years, and I thought I decided I didn't want to become one of those teachers who grew old and grumpy and sat in the common room doing the Times crossword and complaining about how great the days were in the past. So I thought I've got to do something else. And I just looked around, and the fisherman's mission thing really captured my imagination. And then obviously after I'd been to the fisherman's mission, it was a very natural step to do that. But I mean, I've had a really, really interesting life. I mean, I've done parishes and schools chaplaincy and schools work and maritime work, and it's all been so contrasting. And I've certainly I've got some good stories from all those sectors. So no, it's been great. The one thing I'm going to retire next year, so I can spend more time volunteering in Bampton. Overseas. But I'm going to, but it's time, I think it's time for me, it's probably time for the organisation. But the thing I'm most looking forward to is never seeing another aeroplane or airport ever again. I'm really, really have had enough of flying. So who'd have thought? That's one thing that you never know, do you? I mean, I think my most depressing birthday was 30. Julie will remember this, but because I think when you get to 30, you kind of feel all your life choices are probably made. You've got all your children and everything. But life doesn't work like that. It's fantastic where life can take you. And one of the things we do actually, sorry, this is a bit of something I like, but I've just been telling Ron this, but one of the things the Mission Seafarers does is we run cruise chaplaincies for some cruise ships. So part of my retirement plan is to do cruise chaplaincies, and I've just been signed up for the Fred Olsen World Cruise in January 2025. So that's the first part of my retirement plan, which should be quite fun if it ever happens. So we'll see. Great.
Andrew, thank you very much indeed on behalf of the Friends of St Mary's. A small token of esteem. Thank you very much indeed. I hope you've all enjoyed this afternoon's talk. Let's go and get some tea and cake.